right away. So for all of you that are here today and everyone that is online as well, thank you for joining us today. My name is Jake. I work for CameraPro, obviously. So we've got Colin here. Colin's from Canon, as you can probably see by the shirt. And how long have you been there, Colin?
14 years next month.
14 years.
It's been a while.
Seen it all.
Some.
Yeah. And yeah, so today we've got obviously the Canon R5 and the Canon R6, and we have both here today. Yeah, we just wanted to start by thanking everyone for coming and coming to enjoy it with us today. If you have any questions at all, those of you here and those of you that are online, definitely let us know. We'd love to get into it. So I'll hand you off to Colin and we'll get into it. Thanks, guys.
Cheers. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, so firstly, thanks to those in the room for joining us a little bit late there. That's okay. We'll get into it, and by all means, if you've got questions, throw your hand up and we'll sing out, and we'll cover them as we go. A lot of the things that you might have to ask I'll have coming as well. That's okay if we jump ahead or behind, or you want to recap things, that's okay too. And same for online. If you send through your questions as you go, we've got Jackson over here on the computer. He's going to read them out and let me know what we're saying, and we'll try and answer those with you visually and verbally. So yeah, first, thanks for coming along. Obviously, you would have seen in the last few weeks or even months the big lead up to R5 and the tagline of Game On. So back in around February, we kind of let a development announcement go, which is a little bit different to how Canon introduces cameras, and that development announcement was kind of just telling people it's coming. It's coming in a sense that there is another 5 series on its way, and then over the next couple of months we had little bits of more information come, such as the 8K video, IBIS, and a few other bits and pieces, until we were able to come with the rest of the information on the 9th of July, which was kind of when the world heard about R5 in its complete spec lineup. So that came at 10 PM at night for us in Australia, but that was to coincide with US timing as well. If you're wondering why such a late night announcement, that's kind of the reason behind that. So come the 10th of July, the store's phones went crazy, and I'm sure Jake and Jackson, the team here, will be able to tell you it's the biggest thing that's kind of occurred in this part of the industry since the original 5 series came out. So to give you a little bit of a backstory behind it all, yeah, we've been working for Canon for quite some time, but the digital revolution really started off in the mid-90s. And it wasn't until around the 2000 Olympics that digital cameras were into that next level, and it was kind of it was professional to have a digital camera at that point. Still film and crossing over, but the 5 series cameras came out in the mid-2000s, which is about the same time I joined Canon, and I rode through that execution of 5 series. And what that kind of meant, if we put it in context, a 1 series full frame, you're spending somewhere in the vicinity of about 12 to 13,000 Australian dollars just on the body. And when the first 5D came out, it was sort of $65.99 as its first introductory price. So it's like half price for full frame. And the 5 series hit a key note with people, wedding, portrait, studio, creatives, I would say, not just photographers, but creatives, artists, people who may not have used film to develop their art in the past, but they embraced that 5 series. And from there, we had a 5D Mark II, as you'd be aware. At that stage, video started to slowly emerge into SLR, and 5D2 became kind of the hero child of the wedding market, because video became very much a piece of the ceremony, and certainly best man speeches and the bridesmaid of honour speech, and those little bits started to be integrated into a wedding package for the creatives that make their living from that service. And so 5D2 had its place, and time went on. 5D3 came out. There was some worldwide events that occurred which slowed down 5D3, you might remember. Around the same time as in Brisbane, we had some floods as well. So there's obviously some things that occurred from time to time that do change the timeline that we had planned. And then in time, obviously 2016 came along, or 2015 actually, we were kind of our studio, high resolution, commercial photographer, people who are into the composites and the landscapes and that kind of thing. The only difference with the R, obviously being a RAW sensor, didn't have that anti-aliasing filter on it. And so we had 2 options there. And less than 12 months later, 5D4 came out. And 5D4 kind of reset benchmark as to what 5 series should be, or could be. And obviously continued with really big excitement this year, we were able to take the step that a lot of people have been asking for, and that was to introduce the first genuine 5 series mirrorless camera, and we introduced the EOS R5, which I have a product for you. For those in the rooms and I can have a play with it. For those online, you can obviously ask questions, and we'll do our best to show you what we can via the internet. But yeah, the EOS R5 is here, and it was officially launched as in a product to sell last Thursday. So we're literally, they've been in the market now for
About a week.
two business days.
Yeah.
So most people have had hands on for a maximum of about 4 days or 5 days so far, and they're getting out there. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of why we said game on with R5, the idea being that in the catch cry, kind of invented the game in that sense in the full frame market, and this is the next generation of that. And we've certainly been pushed in terms of the technology available on the market from other brands, and this certainly helped us be able to take all the feedback from our consumers, professionals alike, and address some of those things that they were looking for and bring out what we believe is the perfect companion. Obviously, with every Batman there's a Robin, so to speak. There's obviously a sidekick. So R5 being our premium product, you would have seen pricing in market now. It's in and around the CameraPro $6,500. There's also an alternative model, the R6, which we'll go into a little bit more in depth shortly. But they do really serve 2 purposes for 2 different types of creatives. But what I'll show first is there are quite a number of features that are the same on both cameras. So although you're probably very familiar with the megapixel breakdowns and the videos and so forth, we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. There are a few things that both these cameras do, identically in fact. They are a slightly different body in terms of, and you'll get to see and feel them. They're pretty close to each other in terms of weight and the way the grip feels and so forth. But when you look inside the body, things like the image stabilizer in body, or IBIS, that's something that's new to the Canon mirrorless system. And not only have we done IBIS like everyone else, we've taken all the strengths out of the image stabilizer in the lens and combined those 2 together. And I've got a little graphical chart to show you how that works, but what that really means is instead of getting just 5 stops of stabilization, we can actually push as far as 8 stops on certain lenses. And I've got a bit of a mud map to show you which ones are 8, which ones are 7, so forth. So what you can say with confidence is minimum 5 stops. So that's on a lens that has no stabilizer. We get minimum of 5 stops now, right up to 8. So that's pretty cool. I've had about 4 weeks seat time with the R5 and R6, and I have to say, I say this every time, it's the best camera ever owned, of course, but truly, last week on a boat, whale watching, 8 stops of stabilization, oh my God, how easy it was to shoot continuous 4K and 8K footage. So for the stills photographer, perfect daylight, sunny day, you're thinking 2000th of a second, whale goes easy. And that's true. Start looking at 4K or 8K video and tell me that you can do that on a boat in the ocean without a gimbal, which would cost sometimes more than the camera system costs. And it was literally like shooting fish in a barrel. Sorry. The multi-controller AF joystick. Doesn't sound like a big thing, but the 5 series has been known for your right-hand thumb hitting that joystick and making things happen. So again, we've introduced the joystick back into the camera and put it where people want it. 1052 AF zones. You'll see for yourself tonight how fast this can autofocus, and this is the same across both cameras. You've essentially got 100% viewfinder coverage now. So rather than the 61 points or the 65 points, or how we measured it in the past, we can now say anywhere, 100% vertical, horizontal, the whole frame, we can autofocus anywhere. So then when you start talking about, and it goes into a bit further, animal detect or eye detect, if there's a person in frame, even if it's the back of their head, as they turn, it will prioritise to face detect and give you a large box around that person. As they turn towards you and the eyes become obvious, eye detect jumps in. And the cool thing was testing last week, even if you turn eye to eye from camera, the old rule of thumb was always focus on the eye that's closest to the camera. The camera's programmed with that, so as it does that, talking about maybe a centimetre or two's depth difference. It's switching between the two eyes. That's cool, really cool. 20 frames continuous shooting, that's epic. Most people look at a 1DX series camera for fast shooting capabilities. These will do 12 mechanically and up to 20 electronically. In the electronic side of the settings, it is silent. And I don't mean silent as in a quiet actuation, I mean silent. Silent. So if you're thinking courtroom, behind the scenes on a movie or film set, golf, good example. These are places where you can't have shutters clicking away. And I'm sure you've all seen a news conference in the last decade where there's flashes going off everywhere and click, 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 you can barely hear what's going on. I think that was a part of the theatre. I really enjoyed that myself. But I'm thinking that it's time that it's going to start changing and we're going to see less use of those sounds to kind of bring across an environment that you may be familiar with. World's fastest AF in a full frame camera. World's fastest AF is something that seems to be broken each generation. We get faster and faster. And every time you think, how can we get faster than that? And I've thought exactly the same thing this time round too. Again, shooting at the zoo with yourself a couple of weeks ago, Jake.
Yeah.
Being able to use touch focus when we were doing some of the 4K footage of the crocodiles and things like that. And it just snaps.
Super quick.
Not even, that's, again, that was a pretty gloomy day. We should jump to the weather sealing.
Yeah.
The weather sealing, we were drenched. We were absolutely drenched. And we had a couple of R6s and a couple of R5s, and everything came out the other side dandy. So we can certainly put thumbs up on the weather sealing side of things. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Zebra displays, anyone know what that is? Not know what that is? So the video guys, yeah, zebra displays are pretty important to be able to tell what's in focus and also your peaking settings. So we've brought some of those little features across from the cinema series into the R5 and R6. Pretty cool. Those kinds of features kind of really only come into the cameras in that sort of $12,000 plus range. And it's really simple stuff. And we've incorporated that in both of these. Dual card slots, who wanted those? Lots of people wanted dual card slots, yeah?
Yep.
So, R6 we put in 2 SD cards. Yeah, so it's an affordable option, and of course you've got those dual slots there. With the R5, and we'll talk about some of the movie features later, we had to put in a higher speed option than SD can offer. So we have gone with a Compact Flash Express Type B, as well as an SD card slot. So maybe a question you're thinking online is, can I use the camera with an SD card? Absolutely. Everything works with the exception of 8K and 4K 120 frames if you're using SD. So if you pop in a CFE card, those two options will become available. And the cool thing is in the camera, and you can have a look for yourself, if you're making changes in the menu and the card is not up to speed with what you're trying to do, the camera will tell you there and then you haven't got the CFE card in, or your card is too slow in the SD card space. I tested these also with a Type 1 SD, shooting 20 frames per second to buffer out the camera in RAW to see how long it would take to download. The cool thing about this is we don't necessarily have to have the most expensive latest generation SD card. We can get away with the cheapest 16 gig card if we needed to. The only catch is the time it would take to save out of that buffer onto that card. So that's kind of cool if you're a traveller or you are literally down to your last frames and you really need to desperately buy some more media. You don't have to be so picky, you've got that SD card slot there. Digigates. So that's a processor that's in the 1DX Mark III, latest generation processor. Gives the camera all of that power that it needs to do all the features that you've read about. Canon log. I find that there's a lot of people that talk about video specs, but we don't talk much about codecs and the type of saving and colour space and gamuts. I've got a little bit of information there for you tonight. But Canon log is seen as an industry sort of standard really in terms of colour rendition and the amount of data that you can pull into the card as a RAW and then be able to colour render that out later. So it's actually seen as quite a nice colour space. To me or to a stills photographer, you might see that as being like a Canon faithful mode, so a fairly flat LUT. and then you're able to put a grade over that and really pull out some really natural skin tones, and the greens and blues and reds all look kind of like the way how I see them, which is nice. And that has Canon log on both. High files or heat files, something that's only emerged in the last couple of years in the camera industry. JPEG was always kind of the compressed output from a camera. HEIF gives us a wider colour gamut out of camera that a computer or social media can understand without having to process any form of RAW file. So both these cameras obviously have RAW, they have a compressed RAW, they have JPEG in multiple sizes, and HEIF as well. We covered the 100% viewfinder, animal eye detect and human eye detect. You kind of got to see that to understand it and believe it, and so we can have a play with that tonight as well, so you can see for yourself. The vari-angle touchscreen, I think that it's probably one of the highest requested features that people wanted in a 5 Series. And this was quite an accomplishment. You're thinking probably, okay, great, they added a touchscreen. But to keep the weather sealing and the durability of a 5 Series camera, we couldn't take those trademarks away. If I asked 90% of 5 Series users over the years, have you had your camera wet? Have you put it through a bit of treatment? Most of them would say yes. Yeah, it's survived the battles. And so again with the R5, it has to be at that level. Image.Canon is also a new online image sharing or image storage platform. If you haven't seen that, it's probably worth a Google. The quick 10-second explanation is Canon's got a storage space, which is, we're not trying to be Dropbox or Google storage. It's just a place where you can stick all of your RAW files, but it will stay there for a period of time. After 30 days, those RAW files will drop back to low resolution JPEGs, and eventually you can either discard them or not use them further than that. But the cool thing about Image.Canon is kind of a third place to store something. So you can go from there across to Dropbox, across to Google Drive, or across to a hard drive, or whatever your storage method may be. But if you're on an international trip, probably not at the moment, but if you were somewhere that was important and you wanted a third backup, but you didn't want to take all the laptops and hard drives and things with you, then this is an option. High-speed internet coupled with 5 gig Wi-Fi in the R5 means we can upload memory cards in moments. All right, how we going for questions?
I've certainly got a bunch of questions, but did we want to ask anyone to the room if they want to ask any questions as well?
Yeah.
You mentioned the camera automatically focuses artificial intelligence on the eyes. Can you override that?
Yeah, you can certainly turn eye detect off and just run center point autofocus, or throw it around the screen at 100% coverage. So you've got, for the traditionalist like myself, I feel like I'm an old dog not teaching new tricks, but for me personally, I do like having a single point and being able to tell the camera where I want it. And then I might even focus, recomposition and shoot. We can still do all those things. And it's very quick, 2-button press to turn things like the eye detect on and off, face detect on and off. I did find it pretty handy with shooting some dogs and some birds the other day as well. So where single point didn't work in the past because they're unpredictable and uncontrollable, especially birds, eye detect was instant and 100% accurate. So very, very good.
The Zebra display, is that for photo mode or is it for video or both?
Just for video.
Just for video.
Yeah. Yeah.
We might repeat the question, just I'm not sure if people on stream would be able to hear it. But the question there was for the Zebra modes, whether it was for just video or for photos as well, and it was for just video.
Just video, yeah.
Yeah.
And eye detect obviously both. Yeah. Cool, so introducing the R5, I really can't understate what a change this is, in that this is literally a 5 Series camera that is now mirrorless. So this isn't a knockoff at the 5 Series, this is genuinely worthy of the name 5 Series. You can hold it with that same confidence of quality and of course the durability of 5 Series. Which for me over the past 4 generations, if I was to pick one thing out of the 5 Series that means the most to me, is that every time I use it, it stands up to the punishment, works every time. I can take it through a rainforest, I can get stormed on, I can be a little bit not careful, if you may, with the camera, and it's going to take it, and it's going to keep fighting for more, and that's what a 5 Series to me is all about.
Colin, I've got a couple of
Yeah,
questions
sure.
in regards to electronic shutter. Does the R5 struggle from, I guess, the same issues on any of the electronic shutters with static objects in daylight? And will the R6 be better than the R5 in this regard? So I think he assumes like distorting any sort of static objects at all in daylight.
Yeah, line readouts and so forth. Yeah. We've tested to try and make it do it, and we haven't had that happen at all. So even shooting up to 4,000th of a second of birds in flight and panning with the camera, we haven't been able to get it to have any form of distortion in the readout of the sensor. So, and the other cool thing is we can turn off the playback preview in the viewfinder as well. So we can literally just shoot as though we're using a 5 Series DSLR.
Yeah.
So even with the 5 Series, when the mirror pops up, takes the photo, mirror pops down, there's a fraction of a second there where you see black because obviously the prism's closing. With the R5, we can have continuous video feed from the viewfinder and never see the photo being taken. You know, in the silent mode, all you can tell is the buffer number up in the top right starts counting down, and if you're at high speed plus, it counts down 20 in 1 second. So the only indication of the camera taking a photo when it's truly in full silent at 20 frames is watching that buffer number reduce. And if you've got the CFE card in there, for example, it takes forever to hit buffer, and then the zoom, we were up to 4,000 something photos. We gave up the test at that point, so we're not going to be shooting 4,000 continuous photos. So
the fastest one of that reads almost 2 gigs a second, so that's
that's right. The Type
super
B
fast.
cards are anywhere between 128 gigabytes is the smallest, up to 512 commonly available now. But there'll be 1 and 2 terabyte cards in the not too distant future. So yeah. Does that answer that one?
Yep, definitely. And Rosemary asked, how long does the battery last for in real life usage?
I'm going to let Jake answer that one because we did a lot of filming at Australia Zoo 2 weeks ago, and we used the R5s and 6s. We had 2 of each. And we predominantly shot a lot of 4K 50p. It's PAL, not NTSC.
That's right.
A lot of 4K 50p. And of course, I think how many stills did we end up getting through? It was in the thousands?
Yeah, 1,000. We ended up with just under a terabyte worth of files total, I believe. I was shooting a lot of the 8K RAW. I was shooting a lot of the 4K 120, and I don't think I finished through a battery.
You didn't? No. So we took along 4 full batteries in the cameras at the start of the day. And I took about half a dozen spares in case, and we got through 3 spares. So across 4 cameras, we didn't replace 3 of them, and 1 of them we went through 3 because it had recorded about 4 hours worth of 4K footage. So the new battery, probably a good point to bring up. You'll notice the product number ends in NH. So the battery lineup behind that, we had LPE6 that came out with 5D Mark I and 7D Mark I. And then we had LPE6N, which was an extended milliamp hour battery. Now we've got LPE6NH, which is extended again. The cool thing is all 3 batteries work in this camera, and this battery will work in all of the generation of LPE6 battery compatible cameras. The only difference with the newer ones is you'll get more shots to the charge. So even if you took the NH out of one of these cameras and popped it in a 5D Mark IV, for example, you'll experience about 20% more go, essentially.
And it was a software thing, isn't it? Because it's the way that the camera reads the battery, right?
Yeah, and also coupled DigicX gets a little bit more efficiency out of it as well. So there are quite a number of factors in there. On paper, we always put the kind of worst case scenario, so whether that be 300-400 photos to a charge, you'll find that if you're using things like time-lapse mode, you're turning off playback, you'll push out literally up to 800 shots out of a charge in some cases. So there's a lot of variables. I mean, if you get down to the nitty-gritty, a white pixel reads more data than a black pixel in terms of shots. So star trails at night, for example, you'll get far more shots to a charge than if you were doing a time lapse in the middle of the day, simply because the file size will actually be smaller, so the processor works less. Quite a number of variables, so we certainly put a number on it that it will do all day, every day.
Yep.
But the reality of that is a lot more.
Absolutely. Another question from Guido. He wants to know, is it true that they'll be releasing new firmware with C-Log 3 and maybe 4K RAW?
I mean, that's a good time to subscribe to CameraPro's YouTube, I guess. So if we have an announcement to make in those fields, then of course you'll hear it first through your camera retailers. So nothing to talk about in that sense right now. Nothing can be confirmed or denied in terms of firmware updates for these cameras. Being 3 days old, probably a little bit premature to go there at this stage. But yeah, as soon as we know, you'll know. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. So just looking at the R5 a little bit closer, just a couple of the points there. Obviously, we all know 45 megapixel sensor. That's probably one of the first specs anyone looks at in the last 20 years, is how many meg you get. It's quite an interesting fact that you're probably thinking, I mentioned 5DS and 5DSR before, which were 50 meg sensors. You probably think this isn't the biggest sensor that Canon's made, why go for a 45? I'll point out two things straight away. To do 8K video, you need a minimum of 35 and a half. So call it 36, your minimum. We make a 30, we make a 50. The 45 is a completely new generation, unborrowed from any other camera. And the resolving power of this 45, if you have a look into it, the actual edge sharpening, each pixel quality, the pixel pitch of each pixel, quite a lot goes into it scientifically. Essentially what it means is this is technically our highest resolving camera on the market. So a mark or a gauge of megapixels isn't always the total resolution story. 45, I can tell you, is a lot. And I know I've said before, it's the sharpest camera I've ever used, because the 5D4 was the sharpest I'd used prior to this launch. Yep. And coupled the other day with an RF 70 to 200, I was giggling with how sharp the shots were of the Gold Coast skyline. Yep. So sharp that we could read the registration from 800 metres out where the shark nets are on the lifeguard's little buggy that they drive up and down the beach. And that's something that you kind of see in the CSI, resolve it, make it bigger, make it bigger. I just did it, and I did it in camera just using a touch screen, and I was giggling because it was pretty funny. 5.76 megapixel EVF. Okay, this is one of the moments where a light bulb went off for me. Shooting DSLR for so long, the one thing about mirrorless that I always couldn't grasp was the clarity of the image to my eye. I'm a shooter that brings it to the face. I don't use the rear screen a lot, other than setting up time lapses maybe, or star trails or something like that. And it was probably 30 or 40 seconds of shooting, kids in the backyard, that dawned on me I was looking at an EVF. So have a look for yourself tonight. The 5.76 meg EVF is extraordinary. So especially if you turn off that playback preview and you pull the trigger, if you're in silent mode, without watching that number count down, you don't know you're taking photos. With the trigger, obviously the shutter turned on and enabled, you'll feel and hear the 12 frame per section clicks, so pretty impressive. Rear display screen, 3.2 inch, 2.1 million pixels. Again, very high quality, what we would need from a 5 series camera, what's worthy of that badge. We went through the cards, the media, and the reason why we've got two there, so you've got the versatility of a card that is widely available, and I'm sure you've all got 20 SD cards laying around somewhere of various generations. And then of course the CFE card is really responsible for being able to open up the extra video functionality of this camera. Without that, we would still be stuck in 4K 60p, for example. So talking about video resolutions, we touched on it, the 5D is an 8K enabled camera. It will do that 30, it's actually 24, 25 and 30 frames per second. I just want to cover off on what the 25 and 30 actually means. For those who are playing along at home and aren't aware, there are two different video codecs. One is PAL and one is NTSC. NTSC is generally our US friends' frame rate and speed, and PAL is what kind of the rest of the world uses. This actually dates back to Thomas Edison, and that's a whole other education for another day. But the short explanation is, if we were to shoot under lighting on US power grid, we would end up with flicker. So we use an NTSC codec. Everywhere else in the world, we use PAL, and we get beautiful, consistent results. I'll let you Google that one and look into that a bit further. But as for frame rates, in 4K we can do 24, 25, 30, 50, 60, 100, 120. So again, in 4K, it's got the most amount of video options. I think there's a slide coming up. There's 21 different video resolution and codec options in the R5. And the R6 has only got 2 less than that. So, pretty cool. Top mount LCD. So again, people who've got 5 Series would be very aware of having a top mount screen to be able to see what mode they're in, how many shots are left, what battery life's like. And just like the original EOS R, it's a backlit OLED. So even if the camera's turned off, we can see at a glance that it's got power available and what mode we're ready to shoot in. So as soon as we flick on and shoot, we're ready to go. And that OLED doesn't use much power at all. When we were testing the EOS R a couple of years ago, we were theoretically getting months out of the battery with the top LCD on, so no need to disable that. The last piece there, 5 gig Wi-Fi. So for those who aren't as tech savvy as others, most Wi-Fi is 2.4 gig. What does that all mean? It's basically the width of the transmission we can have. So Wi-Fi on our phones, on our home routers, generally all 2.4. And you know what the performance of Wi-Fi is like in terms of speed. Generally not as good as a hardwired connection. 5 gigahertz essentially opens up double the amount of lanes of traffic. So the communication speed's twice as quick. Of course, that does require 5 gigahertz on the receiving end. So the camera has both 2.4 and 5 available. So you don't have to use 5, but it is there for those who need high-speed Wi-Fi. Let's just talk about the R5's video performance. They're worth 3 saving file sizes. So in stills, we all know about JPEGs and RAWs. In video, there's actually 3 different methods. We've got a full RAW, which is a full readout from the sensor. There's All-I, which was considered to be the old RAW, essentially for in-camera processing. And then IPB, which is our compressed version, kind of like a JPEG video, if you may. Between all of those settings, 21 different video resolutions, and the R6 is only 2 less than that. I thought I'd take us down a little educational piece here on video, because it's not talked about as much as stills. And I want to point out what's the difference between 8, 10 and 12-bit video. This camera has the ability to do all 3. And I asked someone once, what's the difference? And they said 2-bit. And what's the difference between 8 and 10? That was a true response. But what that really means is, rather than 16 million colours, we'd get to 1 billion colours. So 16 million, 1 billion. And then the next step into 12-bit is from 1 billion to 68 billion. So I know if we're talking dollars, everyone wants the latter. But what it really means down to a pixel by pixel is how much colour do we capture in each set of red, green and blue. So think of it as options. So when we go to colour grade our video later, a little bit like working on a still in Lightroom, we take one photo and then we apply our creative skill to that photo to create a beautiful photo that we share. The same thing goes for those who are producing video. They can start with a smaller file, which will give them some room. They can move to a 10-bit, which gives them a lot more room. And then there's a 12-bit option, which really is like raw video. I touched on the coordinated IS a little earlier, and I thought I'd just share how that works. There's 5 different sensors between the lens and the camera that are all telling essentially the processor what's going on. How much are you moving? How much movement and acceleration is in the lens? And so the lens and the camera both bring that data together. The processor is then able to give instructions to the lens stabilizer as well as the IBIS to work together. Because you could imagine,
What would happen if you used the older generation L lenses, How does that work? Is this only for the new lenses, new series of lenses?
Yes.
It doesn't apply to the old lenses.
Yeah, so so the question was, does it apply to the old, like an EF-L series lens? Yeah, so you can still use the IBIS and the lens IS together. It just may produce less stops, so it may not reach 8. So when we talk about IS on the new body, we between 5 and 8. And then the long list, which you can Google, will tell you which specific lens, what you'll achieve. But yeah, it's taking all that information still from the lens, two-way communication. You'll notice if you ever pop a lens off one of the Canon mirrorless cameras, there's more contacts on the EOS contacts. That's because there's more data being transferred between the two than ever before.
Yeah, like I believe we were using the EF 100 to 400 when we were at the Australian Zoo, and I think that was one of the lenses that gets 8 stops, right? It was either 7.5 or 8, something like that. I could be wrong.
There, testing my knowledge. I'm going to Google that. It's more than 5, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a long list because obviously there's 87 lenses in the range, so it's hard to remember them
That's
all.
it. But it was good. We used a fair few of the EF lenses that day.
Yeah, speaking, I thought I'd bring up some of the RF lenses so you can see for yourself. These are the ones that have an IS unit in the lens. And you can see down the right hand side, if we turn everything on, we can get between 6 and 8. So in terms of stops, what does that really mean? I thought I'd come up with an example, but let's just say we had a 105mm lens and we were happy with our exposure at 1/200th of a second, and that's kind of right. What 8 stops allows us to do is to drop that down to 1/30th of a second, to put that in reality. So you can imagine, would that be 8 stops of shutter? Could it be 8 stops of ISO? Could I get 8 extra stops of aperture? That's a lot of versatility compared to where we were 4 years ago, the maximum of 5. And then 4 years earlier than that was maybe 3 or 4. If we go back 20 years towards when 30 years now almost since the first IS came out, there was no stops of IS. So we've come quite some distance, and it's quite exciting to see what you can hand hold now. And I mentioned before, as a stills photographer, it's great, but where this is awesome is for video. So gimbals, other external props that you might use with a camera to stabilise it aren't as necessary now. You could quite happily go and handhold a video and come out with a really professional result, as I proved last week. A couple of the lenses that are in the RF range that are not image stabilised in the lens, you can still achieve up to 8 stops of stabiliser from the IBIS. So when I say 5 to 8, it doesn't necessarily mean no stabiliser on the lens means 5, because it can still actually mean 8. So probably best to have a look at Google, and there's a long spreadsheet of all of the lens options with all of the IBIS results for you as well. Okay, that's probably enough about R5 at the moment, Jackson. Is that looking good online?
Yep.
Everyone's happy?
Yep.
Yep, cool. Let's have a look at the R6 a little bit. So probably a lot of people in the room thinking, is the R5 better or is the R6 better? In terms of the focus that everyone's been talking about in the last few months, the R5 has certainly taken the limelight. And that's mainly because the price is the high price. It's kind of seen as the pinnacle product. But the R6 is there as well. It's kind of, as I said, for every Batman there's a Robin. And maybe that primary body is actually the R6 for you. So the R6 sits in a lower price point than the R5. And I wouldn't say that the R5 is any more useful or less useful than R6. They're just made for 2 different types of creatives. One big difference you'll see between the two is the sensors megapixels are 20 on the R6 as opposed to 45 on the R5. Now that comes with pros and cons. Obviously the first thing you're thinking is less resolution, and that's correct. But what it means is a larger pixel pitch. What that means is much better low light capabilities for those who are shooting in practical darkness. The R6 is the first camera where we can autofocus down to -6.5 EVF. EV, I dropped in the F there. Viewfinder, a lot of acronyms. So 6.5, -6.5. So that's like shooting a candle in a warehouse from 100 metres away and being able to autofocus on a click of a finger. That's incredible. Of course, the ISO capabilities are 1 stop higher than the R5, so we can go that extra space. We can still do 4K with this camera. Because it's equipped with 2 SD card slots instead of an SD and a CF, then that 4K has to be capped at 50 or 60p, depending on whether you're in PAL or NTSC. Of course, we'll still do full HD at high speed too. So if you're into skateboard park tricks, breaking things, make videos, blowing balloons with pins and things, you can shoot that at 120p quite happily, still in full HD. And as you know, savvy social media users, 4K is not that widely accepted yet to share. So on Facebook, generally you're sharing 720. On Instagram, depending on your account and your subscription, 720 or 1080. So 4K is really relegated to Vimeo, YouTube at this stage, and sometimes it's a paid subscription also. So 4K 120 or 1080 120 are both very good options. I should also address the elephant in the room there. The bigger the video file, the bigger the file is going to be. And you want to give us an idea of how long it's taken to chomp through some of the footage that you took last fortnight?
I'd love to. So some of the 8K footage and the 4K 120, to be honest, none of us had the spec'd out computer for work to handle the 8K. And the computer crashed, I want to say at least 30 or 40 times. It took us a long while, we got through it, but yeah, unless you've got a really hectic editing rig, the R6 might be the go for you. And the files are definitely a lot more manageable.
Yeah, so yeah, the R6, a lot of the stuff I did the other day, I was using the R5.
Yeah.
I was still at 4K 60 or 4K 50 when I changed over to PAL for the other tests.
Yeah.
And the reason for that wasn't because I didn't need the big files. Big files are great.
Yeah.
It was more about the speed in which I needed to turn that file around in time for you guys to be able to create that and get it out straight away. So, you know, someone said to me, again, the elephant in the room is 20 minutes of 8K is not enough time. And I was thinking to myself, what would you shoot in 8K that required more than 20 minutes? And then I thought to myself, how much data is that? So, if you grab my R5 here with a CFE card in it, 512 gigabyte, and you set it to the highest resolution 8K, it will tell you, with a formatted card, nothing on it, that you have a maximum capacity of 24 minutes. That's when the card runs out. That's 512 gig of data for you. So, my point coming back to when would you do that? For me, I think 8K would be the kind of moment where I want to shoot 30 options or 30 stills at 35 megapixels. So maybe it's the wedding ceremony, it's the first kiss, and I want 30 options to pick the right RAW file from and say that's the moment, that's the perfect moment. So it might be a kiss lasting for 5 seconds and I've now got sort of 180 frames to choose from to get that right micro expression that I'm looking for in both the bride and groom. You might be thinking, yeah, but I can do 20 frames a second at 45 meg, and that's cool too, but what if you can have more? Isn't that what all the camera technology is about, is getting more each generation? And so the same thing goes for the 4K at 60 or 4K at 120. I was reminiscing today with the other Colin around an Australian Geographic shoot we did on the tree-dwelling funnel web. The tiny little spider behind a trapdoor. If you've ever not seen one, have a Google. You'll find there's not a lot of great photos of them in their natural habitat. The reason why is when you trigger their tripwire, they're in and out of that hatch. And the term blink and you'll miss it is absolutely true. You try and get them to do it twice, they're not dumb spiders. They're very smart. So I see the R5, for instance, shooting 4K 120, or the R6 at 1080 120 with some nice LED, constant light to give us enough go, and we'll be able to catch that spider, theoretically speaking, 4 frames in and out. You can't do that currently with a stills camera without some form of mechanical trigger. So again, it's about options. The video doesn't necessarily have to be for video. Just remember 4K is 16 megapixels in round terms, and 8K is 36 megapixels. So it's giving you that frame rate times megapixels as options to pull from the video. Pretty cool. Sorry, I got sidetracked. Get really passionate.
No, that's great. That's great.
For those who know me, I'm a stills guy through and through, but the more I see the video functions, I'm adapting in my brain how I would use that to benefit my stills work. Yeah, a couple of little things. The main thing, as I said, between these two is we've been through the video specs, but the low light capabilities come up a little bit higher in the R6. If we put the two side by side as the shared things that these cameras do, and then look at the strengths of the R6 versus strengths of R5, you notice that there are two different cameras and they're going to fit two different markets. I'd hate to say you're a wedding photographer, you need an R5, but that's not the truth. I've spoken to many wedding photographers in the last couple of weeks. Half are saying I need an R5 and half are saying I need an R6. So they are two different creatives in this market space. I guess it comes down to what you're coming from, what you might be upgrading to, what your aspirations are in terms of video, or how you want to push the creative limits in low light in the future. And I think the politically correct answer is you need an R5 and an R6.
And the 1DX3.
And a 1DX3 for good measure, of course. So a couple of things there. How are we going for questions? Going all right?
Yeah, good.
Cool. All right.
Have we got anything there?
The room's feeling good?
Yeah, everyone's good.
Yeah. How about in here? Does anyone have any questions before we go?
So far, so good.
I
Yeah.
guess I got one.
Sure.
I just want to ask, for the R5 and R6, when you're shooting through the electronic shutter, do you need to disable the anti-flicker like you kind of have to when you shoot on the EOS R and RP if you want to shoot silently, or is that not the case anymore?
No, so the silent shooting was the question, how, you know, with the different options. There's two things that we need to consider. One is if we're in one-shot autofocusing mode and we've still got beeps enabled, that's going to make noise. So we need to either disable beeps or move to servo focusing. That's step one. And then step two, to activate the silent shutter, we need to drop out the mechanical. So we can do that in single frames, burst frames up to 20. But essentially we're not going to see a flicker between those frames, but in terms of the audible side of the camera, there are two settings we need to consider.
Oh no, I mean like anti-flicker as in like
De-flicker?
It kind of times the shutter under light sources that aren't consistent, and it's like if you turn off that anti-flicker function, you're going to see scan lines on your photos that kind of represent the flickering lights, but if you have anti-flickering on, it kind of looks like the light source is consistent. And all I was just kind of wondering is, do you have to turn off that function if you want to shoot through the electronic shutter on the R5 and the R6?
No. That's the short answer. No, you don't. No. So with deflicker, just so you know, if you're set to 2000th of a second, 20 frames per second, so the highest settings, with deflicker enabled, you may not achieve a full 20 frames a second because the camera has to see that moment between the flickering. Deflicker was something that I think it was 1DX Mark II pioneered.
Yeah.
I was an avid sports shooter, a lot of work out of Suncorp Stadium and the Gabba and the local grounds here, and I found they did a massive upgrade to the lighting systems at Suncorp around 2018, but prior to that, deflicker was a must. It was a game changer. 1DX2 was just killing the 1DX1 in terms of the usable frames, not because of focus, not because of lenses, it was because of flicker of the lights. But in 2018, they made a change to their lighting system, which completely corrected that. And deflicker was no longer necessary. But there are still sporting stadiums around Australia that aren't as in tip-top shape like some of the more prominent venues. And I can give you an example of that was Atherton Rodeo. I'm talking about a local football ground in Atherton in far north Queensland, and all they had was 4 spotlights, 4 floodlights. That was really hard shooting, and deflicker paid for itself. So in those situations, noise isn't an issue, so silent shutter was not enabled, but deflicker certainly was. So you'll find, given your situation, it's going to be different. I'm thinking the time where you might run into that would be maybe on set behind the scenes on a movie or TV production where the lighting is really specific, but you have to shoot in silent. So in those situations, what I would probably do is shoot more than you think you need to then be able to pull out the frame that you want. So always a way around the situation you're put in. A couple of things I thought I'd bring out too with other new lines. Just we discussed the battery before. The new battery is a lot bigger, but there's a new battery grip, and that battery grip is compatible across both bodies. So we have made one grip for 2 bodies, There is also a WFT-R10A, which is a external wireless transmitter, which is for the R5 only. And although this has 5 gig inbuilt Wi-Fi, if you're in commercial photography, you want tether, you want an even more robust connection, you may opt to get a WFT-10A, which acts like battery grip. Now, point out here so everyone knows, there's 2 battery slots in the Wi-Fi adapter. That does not mean it's a battery grip. One battery runs the camera, one battery runs the Wi-Fi. So just with that particular product, I've seen some reviews online. The 2 batteries are definitely for 2 different uses. So yeah, so that's there. And then of course there's a couple of new lenses. The 85mm f2, really cost-effective macro lens with quite a good aperture, f2 for portraits. It's going to be quite popular with our units here, and of course 8 stops of coordinated IS. There was also the 100 to 500, which is not here till September. If you're wondering, it's probably a question that will come up. I think it'll be pretty popular with obviously the sporting community. The 2 that have probably been the talk. Sorry, yeah.
Maybe
Is there a
make
question
sure
in
that
there?
screen's up on the...
Yeah, sure.
What's the refresh rate on the EVF on these guys?
Refresh rate in hertz. Hertz 50.
50 Hz.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're in NTSC, I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it converts over to 60 because it has to be native to the video source it's reading from. But in PAL terms, in what we would use it for, 50.
Yeah.
How many guys here are shooting bird photography or wildlife shooters?
Couple?
So this is probably a lens that you guys are looking out for, or something a bit longer in the RF range. So if you just want to just quickly cover maybe these lenses for the wildlife guys?
Yeah, I was going to say these 2, this one, the 800 and the 600, which are side by side. This has probably been the most I've talked about a non-L series lens in forever.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of people are interested in an 800 or 600mm lens being under $2,000 to buy. And what's the catch? Well, they are an f11 lens. So for those who are thinking about that, if I take the 800 as an example, this is a sub $2,000 retail lens, which can autofocus at f11. And remember, the EOS R5 and R6 can actually autofocus at f22. So very different to a DSLR. These are totally within autofocus range. And at 800mm, our depth perception is very different to a 16 to 35, for example. So if we were to make an 800mm 2.8, it would be massive, like huge, and very, very costly. So this is a great opportunity for those who are into birding and wildlife to get a cost-effective lens that has a lot of throw on it. And as I said, this will autofocus on the R5 and R6. So will the 600. And to put the cost perspective, I'll grab your question in a second. The 800mm 5.6 EF is about $18,500. So you're looking at around maths, 10 times the money to get an aperture of 5.6 versus 11. And in the 600mm case, it's around $16,000 for the f4 version. I'm not saying it's unachievable, or it's definitely, we're going to sell more of these 600mm f11s because they're in that I think about $1,600 roughly for you guys.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So
the other thing I guess as well that I'll just quickly mention is a lot of people that are shooting sports or wildlife or anything like that. You're used to maybe using something like the 100 to 400 or the new 100 to 500. By the time you get a 2x teleconverter on that to get it to these kinds of focal lengths, your equivalent aperture is going to be around f11 anyway.
yeah, or more in the 100 to 500. And that's a good point to say the 2 converters that are coming. Sorry to take your question.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know how heavy are those lenses?
Yeah, I have only touched the 800 myself. I'd have to look up the exact specifications, but you're looking around sort of 35, 40 centimetres long, including hood. And to me, I feel it's about a kilo and a bit, like 1.2, 1.3. I have to look up the number exactly for you, but not heavy, not huge. They're around the roundness of like a Pringles tube. Yeah, a little bit longer. The cool thing is both of the new extenders, the 1.4 and the 2x, are compatible with both the 6 and 800. So think about that for a minute. 800mm, 2x extender, that's 1600mm of zoom for less than $3,000.
I was wondering if you answer this. How come does the digital converters doesn't work on the RF7200 f2.8 that recently came out last year? How come doesn't it work on that lens?
Yeah, put basically, if you look closely at the extender, there's a part that extends into the back of the lens that it's touching, that it's equipped to. And in the RF lenses, the whole point of those was the lens, the rear element comes closer to the sensor.
Yeah, the flash.
So in the case of the 70-200, there is no room to put the extender in. As where with the longer versions, such as the 6 and 800, we've got that space to accommodate that optical magician act.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is quite a bit of magic goes into creating that, and there has been photos of planets put online in the last few days of people with the 800mm 2x converter. Couple that with an R5, you've got 45 megapixels resolution. There's a lot going on there, and as I said, it's to some it's cost effective, to others it's not. But to put it in perspective, you can't get 1600mm at the moment without a lot of trickery. And this is putting a 1600mm option in your hands for less than $3,000.
Just touching on that, Clive, who is watching in today, asked about the RF lenses on EF bodies. Unfortunately, the technology just doesn't allow it.
Yeah, there's a bit of physics behind it. So one thing we can't do is break the laws of physics yet. But there's a flange distance between the sensor and the back of the lens, and with an EF lens, that distance is greater than on an RF system with the mirrorless. So we're bringing the lens closer, the rear lens element closer to the sensor than ever before. So the reason we can get an EF adapter onto one of these is it essentially acts as a spacer, and it communicates through the contacts out to the older style EF lens, or EFS lens even.
Yep.
But yeah, with an RF, if we were to take it further from the sensor, it wouldn't focus. Yeah, so we can go that way, but
Does
not
that
that way.
change the bokeh using an old lens?
No, so if you were to use an EF on a DSLR and then an EF on one of these, you'd experience the same.
300 f2.8, will it affect the background, or does it still come nice and clean?
You're still clean on both because the distance between the rear element, or the flange distance between there and the sensor, is identical. Because all the adapter is doing is giving you the gap and communicating all the pass-through for the IS and the aperture and so forth.
And so is the coverage of the sensor size as well, so that won't affect depth of field. It may affect sharpness, but I'm sure Colin might be able to touch on that.
Yeah, look, anything that you add, anything there's more connections, it's you could definitely affect sharpness if you had something loose, for example, or was heavily worn out bayonets and things like that. So we saw that in the past with lenses that were 10 years old and beaten around by newspaper photographers and thrown in boots without bags, and they'd often break parts off the back of the lens. It looks catastrophically horrible, but it is something that we make as a soft point, for instance, to break rather than smashing the whole lens. But if you were to loosen up that rear mount, then you could end up with some softness, as you can imagine. An optical element needs to be true and straight.
And that's the thing with the adapter is that you shouldn't, in theory, lose that much sharpness just with a new EF lens and an adapter, because the EF lens is going to be putting light into the sensor the same way that it would on a DSLR. So the lens should technically perform roughly the same, but you don't have to do any kind of autofocus calibration.
No, because essentially even on DSLR, if you take the lens off and put your finger in there, there's an air gap, and that distance is measured. And all the adapter's doing on the mirrorless lens is creating that same air gap. So yeah, there's no difference in that sense at all.
I did get a question about stabilisation and turning it off through the menus. Is that going to be the easiest way to do it? How did you guys go turning off the stabilisation?
Yeah, there's a tiny little hand symbol with looks like Wi-Fi symbols on the outside of it, so it's like saying shaky hand. That's the stabilizer icon on the menu here.
Yep.
If you turn off stabilization on the lens, it automatically turns the whole stabilization system off. If it's on the lens, it turns it on. So I would think the easiest way to do it is on the lens, because it's a click of a button. Yeah, but you can also, on these cameras, you do have one extra button down here, which you find on pretty much every DSLR, which
Yeah.
is a custom function button. So if there is one particular menu item that you want to go to regularly, then you can set up this button to be able to do that. For me in the past, I've used that to switch between iServo and servo focusing and one shot, for example, in my workflow. That's just me. Sorry, yeah.
I was just going to say, just using EF lenses and turning stabilisation off, would that have to be done through the menu, or can you still do that through the
lens? All the stabilised lenses have a switch on the side, so I would think that that's the easiest option.
Yeah, definitely.
This might be a bit of a puzzling question, but if you already have say 70-200 f2.8 series 2 or something, and then you have EF2X stabilizer, can you then put that whole 400 f5.6 equivalent set onto an EOS?
Absolutely.
Or R5, I should say in this case.
Yeah. You just need the EF RF adapter, because the 2x extender you're referring to.
With the extenders, EF extenders.
Works exactly the same as it would on your DSLR. So the one cool thing that the adapter can do that your DSLR can't do, if you're a full frame DSLR user like a 5D4 for example, you can never put an EFS lens on it, so the short back lens. As where with the EF RF adapter for a mirrorless camera, whether that be the RP, the R5 or 6, you can certainly use EF and EFS.
There is a crop mode internal.
There is a crop mode internal for the EFS because it is a crop lens, but physically speaking it fits, and you'll notice on the adapter there's a red dot and a white dot. So what that means is someone who's got like a 90D or an 80D or something like that, they can take with confidence all the lenses they had for that kit and adapt it into a mirrorless kit. As where in the past moving to full frame would mean they'd have to closely look at those lenses and decide yes that one, no that one. As where now you can say yes to everything.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it might be a bit more cost effective to jump over into mirrorless because you know that every lens you've got will work.
I did have a question too from Dodger.
Yeah.
He says, is it true all eye will be added to the R6?
Again, something that I can't confirm or deny. Anything that is announced by Canon Inc. generally you'll see on social media within a minute of it being advertised or being announced. So we do have a process in place where we can't confirm or deny something until it's official. So I can look you in the eye there and say I don't have that information to give you, I'm sorry.
Yep, no, that's okay. And obviously the level of support for the EOS R with firmware updates was very constant and improved quite a lot. Can we expect to see the same going forward with the R5 and R6?
Yeah, the cool thing about anything that's electronic like this is firmware can be often a source of upgrades for a camera without it having to return to a service centre. So it's probably different to other mechanical things that you buy that require people to physically service it. This is something that we do have the option to change and update and improve and then send that out via a firmware update, which of course is free. And I believe you offer some firmware update sessions in store as well. So if you do buy a camera and a firmware is available, you can come in and see the guys and they do educational sessions on how to do that.
Yep.
So yeah, no unnecessary servicing costs in that sense. And yeah, if it is something that is identified and fixable via firmware, no doubt over the lifespan of the camera there will be firmware updates. All cameras in the past have had them. Over the many years that they've been used. So, but again, being 3 or 4 days old, a little bit premature to talk about firmware update at this stage. Other than to say it's probably inevitable that over the next number of years there would be some firmware.
Software like Lightroom, this is seamless.
Sorry.
You're not going to have the problems with software, processing software like Lightroom?
Lightroom, yeah, certainly. So Adobe, Avid, Final Cut, all the various video and stills platforms that people use, you'll find that they will update the RAW codec within generally a week or two of a release of a new camera. The reason for that is they really only get the software language the day of release to you, the public. Sometimes they get it in advance, but often no.
Yeah, there was a problem when Apple changed their operating system, and then there was a period of a good 2 months where you couldn't download process the thing without a lot of problems actually.
In iPhoto?
It was between Adobe and Canon, and between Adobe and Lightroom, being able to download from the camera into the computer.
I don't know. No. So like the Adobe RAW codec, they made an announcement that there would be an R5 CR3 reader, and there was a date that was advertised on it that would be no later than the 14th of August. So when it comes to reading the RAW files, Canon supplies DPP, which is free, and then generally Lightroom's very popular. Most of the market would use Lightroom. It is up to Adobe to write that software and then update their customers who are paying that subscription. So that's not fobbing it off as not being Canon's thing, but it isn't us that write that software. That is Adobe, and they need the time to do it. So I can't comment on them doing it faster, slower, or otherwise. The only time I can think of where we've had an issue in the past was there are some certain shows around the world, like Photokina, for instance, and that's where a lot of manufacturers show off a lot of cameras. There was one year, I think it might have been the 5D Mark IV, was released a little bit before Photokina, and it wasn't until the first day of Kina that they released the RAW codec along with 11 other cameras' codecs. So they didn't want to pester people with multiple updates in a short period of time, so they banked them all to do one update. But again, that's third-party software. That it's a good question for Adobe and Apple, to be honest.
And something I'll just mention as well, another feature that isn't one of the big ones that we haven't talked about, but it's one we used on our shoot, was RAW to JPEG in-body conversion. So when we were shooting, Lightroom couldn't take the RAW files. I'm still not certain if they can. Again, that's for Adobe. But I'd already started shooting with RAW files, and I'd had a look and said, well, I'm not going to be able to do anything with these. The camera actually has a RAW to JPEG conversion in body. So you can either do it to your second card or you can do it to the same card. So if you're really in a pickle and you need those images, you can't just convert it to a JPEG, and the JPEGs will read fine.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, and HIF is it's another format that a new computer happily accept that. Windows 10, Mac, the latest Macs will do HIF happily. Older hardware doesn't understand HIF, so you can also convert that back to JPEG as well. Yeah. So yeah, usually with the to talk 8K for a minute. Final Cut Pro today. Speaking today, Final Cut Pro have an 8K RIP software that pulls the 8K down to a language that it can understand, so you can work with the 8K today. But again, over the next couple of weeks, I'm sure those who've got the Adobe Creative Suite and Premiere and other programs, you'll see updates become available over the next couple of weeks that will update that and give you native 8K software. So as I said, it's kind of the same as when new operating systems come out. All the manufacturers of the peripherals have to write new drivers. Kind of the same thing for the aftermarket third-party processing softwares. They have to write the language to read those files. That's common across all cameras.
Can I ask a question related to 1DX?
Yeah, 1DX question, sure.
In the 1DX, there's the options for tracking stuff coming towards you or moving fast or moving at variable speed, so you can pick a setting which applies.
Case modes.
Yeah.
Do these do it?
Have those options as well?
Absolutely, yeah.
Is it similar options, or is it a different version?
No, very much the same. So the question was, do the R5 and R6 have the tracking options like the 1DX 1, 2 and 3? They're called case modes in the purple menus, and it's referring to the servo focusing modes. So generally case 1 is where they come out of the box, and that's the most universal automatic. But then, as you said, case 2, 3 and 4 are set up for options: high speed, decreasing or increasing acceleration, coming to or from the camera. All those modes are in there with the 5 and 6 as well. You'll find that you won't be able to see them if you had the camera in auto, for example, but if you flick to any of the manual functions like TV, AV, or of course full manual, that menu will appear. So when you're in auto on the camera, there's far less menus to pick from because it's kind of being auto, it's making those decisions for you. So if you do pick up the camera and you don't see that there, it's the first of the purple menus, number 1 purple, then just flick to a manual mode and it'll pop up. Sorry, Jackson, you had a...
Yeah, just in regards to R5 and R6 for sport shooting, why would someone pick one over the other in regards to that? Do you think?
Yeah, so sports shooting, generally speaking, from an electronic news gathering point of view, megapixels resolution is not the first pick. Generally speaking, frame rate, so FPS, will be certainly the deciding factor, and both cameras do 20 in electronic. So I guess with those, a couple of options would come to mind. One is price, certainly. So if we needed multiple bodies, then the 6 would be a more attractive purchase because it's going to cost less overall. And it also gives you more money for glass as well. So resolution kind of goes out the window there. And if we're not doing any video at all, then the 4K 60 versus 4K 120 is not going to be a factor. So yeah, again, shooting birds, shooting sport, you know, publishing things at 72 DPI, the R6 has got it covered really. The only reason you go to R5 is if you ultimately want to blow these things up to really large capabilities, or you want to crop into the photo. So remember, 45 megapixels, if you cropped in at 2 times, essentially you're still left with 22.5 megapixels. Yeah. So there's that factor too. So you could take that 800mm lens with the converter, make it 1600mm, then crop it 2 times. Theoretically at 3200mm, like we're spotting planets at that point.
And file size would be the other thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Storage you have, like if you're taking thousands and thousands of photos a day, if you're someone like a NASCAR driver or shooter, or something like that, 20 megapixels over 45 megapixels, you're just going to save a lot more space.
Yeah, in the news segment, the reason why a 1DX or 1D series camera hasn't progressed past 20 is that's considered to be heaps. So 20 is a sweet spot, really. It's a nice pixel pitch, good low light performance and good speed, so good file size.
V8 supercars or F1, for example, would be same sort of issues. You don't want to be putting that kind of high resolution, filling up your cards, filling up everything straight away. Yeah,
potentially not. But if you have to have one camera, then maybe the R5 is the option, and you just down the file size slightly if that's an issue. So the options are there either way.
Yep. Any other questions from the room at all, guys?
Yeah.
The AA filters, are they applied on the sensors on this camera?
Yeah, AA filters on both cameras, yes. Yeah. Cool.
I think now is a good opportunity for everyone to actually get a first taste with the camera, for those who haven't as well. Some hands-on stuff. So Shane's just going to grab some sanitary goods so we can make sure we keep COVID safe, but it's a good chance for everyone to actually handle the camera and go through the camera a little bit more.
The question is, when can you have it available?
Which one would you like? Yeah, that's a good question. So the availability piece. So R5 went on sale on the 30th of July. At the moment, I believe Australia-wide sold out of R5s, I'm afraid. So it's going to be, the honest answer is difficult for me to give you, but it could be up to 8 weeks if you ordered one today. There is a very long queue for R5s at the moment. R6, on the other hand, launches officially in store on the 27th of August. So you can't get one of those yet. They're a couple of weeks away, and R5 a few more weeks than that.
Get your pre-orders in for the R6, I would say.
The fastest way to get one is to order it today, and then you'll be first in line in that queue from the time you order it to getting it. So yeah, that's the honest truth.
Yeah.
Cool. Anyone? Any more questions? Last questions? No.
All good.
Cool. I'm sure you're all excited to have a play. Can we just thank Colin and Jake for coming down and answering all your questions? Just be mindful when you do use the cameras to give everyone enough time, just out of courtesy. We've still got another half an hour at least, so we've still got some time. But just make sure everyone gets a bit of a go. That would be awesome.
Yeah, cool. Before we cut off on stream, thanks to everyone that joined us on the internet. We hope you're able to get your answers, well, your questions answered. And yeah, thank you, Colin, very much for coming out. We always like having you here. And yeah, for everyone that's here, feel free to ask Colin. Feel free to ask other Colin at the back. And I've had a fair bit of raps with the camera as well, so we're happy to answer anything that you have. All right, thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
You got the white.
I'll get this is just one
Okay, cool.
I'll wipe the rest
Cool.
and then we'll do yeah. So we'll just leave it. Yeah, just gonna wipe the cameras and like this time I'll have to pour off to use. Yeah, if you want to use box.
Pleasure.